Right, Jeanette, are you there?
Yes, Chairman, we're now streaming live on YouTube. Thank you.
Good. Right, well, we're going to go now. We're going to get on with it. Right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of Boston Borough Council's Corporate and Community Committee. My name is Councillor Stephen Woodliff, and I'm the chairman of this committee. My vice chairman is Councillor Anton Dunny, who sits to my left. Firstly, can I ask all of you, when you're speaking, that you please do so using the microphones carefully, especially without getting too close to them. But I have one particular member who needs us to get close to them, if I'm right. Yes? So I'm going to say, make sure you're close so that Councillor Yvonne Stevens can actually hear what you're saying. Can you hear me? You can. Brilliant. I must advise you that this meeting is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. I will now ask committee members to introduce themselves. So if I pass myself to my left.
Thank you. I'm Councillor Anton Dunny. I'm the Deputy Chairman. Thank you.
Is it working?
Yes, I'm Councillor Alison Austin, a member of this committee. Oh,
Now it's working.
now it's working, so I'm lucky. Right, if you didn't hear me first time, I'm Councillor Alison Austin, and I'm a member of this committee. Thank you.
Councillor Tom Ashton, likewise member of the committee.
Councillor Yvonne Stevens, also a member of this committee. Thank you.
Councillor Judith Skinner, a member of this committee and ward member for Fishtoft.
Councillor Martin Howard, also a member of this committee.
It will work.
That is on now. Hello, Councillor David Brown, ward member for Curtin and Frampton, a member of this committee.
Frank.
That's it, gone now. Councillor Frank Pickett, member of the committee and also Mayor of Boston. Thank you.
Councillor Paul Goodell, I'm substituting for Councillor Alan Bell, who is a member of this committee.
And we're supported by our officer here.
Andy Fisher, Interim Deputy Chief Executive.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome our guests this evening. I would like to welcome our guests this evening who have kindly joined us for discussions on the sole topic of business this evening, Pilgrim Hospital's operating model. Some are here in person and some are joining us virtually. Please can I ask you to introduce yourselves? So Sandra, can you get as close as you can to the microphone, please?
Hi, I'm Sandra Williamson, Chief Operating Officer for Lincolnshire CCG.
It will work eventually.
Evening, everybody. I'm John Stone. I'm the Chief Executive of NHS Lincolnshire CCG.
Are these working?
I'm sorry. I can't get.
Do you want to try again? Yes, you're on. If the red light's on, you're on.
Do you want to use mine, John? Did you catch me? No? Okay. I see. Good evening, everybody. I'm John Turner. I'm the Chief Executive of NHS Lincolnshire Clinical Commissioning Group, CCG.
Hello, everybody. Dr. Andrew Ian Dodrell. I'm a GP in Boston, have been for the last 30 years. I've previously been a clinical lead in East Lincolnshire, and prior to that, the chairman of East Lincolnshire CCG. I'm standing in for our lead, Dr. Howarth, this evening at the request of John.
Thank you very much. I'd also like our two other further councillors, Jonathan Noble and Katie Chalmers, if they can be announced. Can you get to a microphone? Can you get to a microphone, Jonathan? No, can you announce yourself as being here, please, if that's possible?
Councillor Jonathan Noble, a member for Fishtoft. Thank you, Chair.
And Councillor Katie Chalmers, Skirbeck Ward.
Thank you very much. I think that's everyone. Right. As I mentioned before, yes, Jeanette.
We do have Councillor Judy Wellborn joining virtually, observing, and also one of our guests, Simon Evans.
Right, thank you very much. Right, I think that's everybody anyway, been announced. We'll now move to part 1 of the agenda, the preliminaries, which is first the minutes of the meetings held on the 7th and 20th of July and 17th of August. Do I have members' permission to sign these minutes as a correct record?
Yes.
Agreed.
Good. Yep, right, good, thank you very much. I'll do that some other time. Yeah. To receive apologies for absence and notice of any substitutions, if any. Jeanette.
Thank you, Chairman. I've received apologies from councillors Alan Bell and Vivienne Edge, and received notice that Councillor Paul Goodale is attending as a substitute for Councillor Bell. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, to receive any declarations of interest in respect of any item on this agenda. Does any member have any interest to declare? That's any elected member. Any elected member have anything to declare? No. Good. To receive any written questions from members of the public. Jeanette.
There are none, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Right, that concludes the preliminary items. We move now to part 2 of the agenda and the sole item of business tonight, Pilgrim Hospital's operating model. A number of questions were submitted for our guests in advance. Would our guests like to start by answering those? I'll hand it over to you, and I'll actually allow you to basically run the questions as you would like to run them. Members would probably like to ask supplementaries to the various questions they come along, and I allow anybody to ask any questions, all right? It's a free house in that regard, all right? Okay, over to you, John.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you, Chair. If I could make a few sort of opening comments and just give you a brief update on some of the key things that are going on in our health service at the moment. Set the scene for our discussion, and very happy, of course, to then get into the questions that you've raised, we're very happy to have the conversation with you. We're absolutely delighted to be with you. Thank you for inviting us. We really appreciate your interest in the health service generally, and obviously the health service here serving the people of Boston, and we are at your service this evening. Thank you very much for having us. I thought I would just sort of set the scene a little bit in terms of the structure of the NHS and what's what, and then a little bit about what's actually happening for patient services at the moment in the county. So firstly, I'm the Chief Executive of NHS Lincolnshire Clinical Commissioning Group. I've spent my entire career in management and leadership positions in our National Health Service. I'm actually originally from the county as well, so I'm very familiar with Lincolnshire, the challenges we have across the county, and the dynamics of our large rural county, the relatively aging population we have, some of the issues around deprivation that we have to meet across the county, but particularly towards the east of the county as well. Obviously, my colleague Sandra has been working in the NHS in the county for a long number of years as well, and Sandra has a particular responsibility to look after the east locality, which includes Boston for me, and you live in the town as well, don't you, Sandra? Yes, and obviously Andrew, you'll be familiar as a long-serving doctor in the town. The NHS Lincolnshire Clinical Commissioning Group is essentially the part of the NHS that is responsible for receiving NHS allocations from government and for planning and organising health services in the county. So we're sort of a planning, organising, commissioning authority. And clearly we receive a lot of taxpayers' money and we do our level best to deploy that in the best interests of the people of Lincolnshire. Of course, most people who work in the NHS in the county work in what we call providers. We have a number of provider organisations in the county. These are NHS trusts. So of course we have United Lincolnshire Hospital NHS Trust, which amongst other things is responsible for Pilgrim Hospital here in the town. We have what's called Lincolnshire Partnership Foundation Trusts. They're responsible for all mental health service provision in the county and obviously in the town as well. We have the Community Health Trust, which is responsible for all community services, so community nursing, community hospitals, wide range of community sort of physiotherapy, speech therapy, etc. services. Clearly, we have the ambulance service. We have 85 general practices across the county. Of course, we have a number in the town. And then there are other colleagues as well, such as the pharmacists, optometrists, and dentists as well. But the point I'm really making is that the vast majority of people who work in the NHS in the county are, of course, concerned with direct provision of healthcare to our population. The role that the Clinical Commissioning Group has, and as Chief Executive, is to try to coordinate services across the county. The NHS Lincolnshire Clinical Commissioning Group, we receive a lot of money from government, approximately £1.3 billion a year, which of course is essentially, it's not quite, but it's more or less the NHS budget for the county, which then of course we then deploy out to the trusts and to the GP practices to support them to deliver direct patient care. As well as receiving public money, of course, we receive, it's usually called guidance, but obviously it's the instructions from government in terms of what they're looking for us to deliver with that money. That's where the targets come in and the expectations. And the Clinical Commissioning Group is then managed by NHS England in terms of how well we do that. So hopefully that's a reasonably clear description of the way in which the structures work. In terms of within Lincolnshire then, we have one CCG, 3 NHS trusts plus the ambulance service, 85 general practices, and a range of others such as pharmacists, optometrists. What is really, really important is that we work together as one Lincolnshire NHS team, serving the people of the county as best we possibly can with the resources that we have at our disposal. Prior to there being the NHS Lincolnshire CCG, there were 4 CCGs in the county, including East Lincolnshire CCG, which Sandra and Andrew were both involved in. We decided a couple of years ago that we wanted to basically merge the 4 into one CCG because we felt that was going to give us much better opportunity to coordinate how care is delivered in the county, and particularly to work with our colleagues in local governments across the county as well. So it was a move to remove duplication and make it simpler for us to do what is obviously a demanding and complex role. It's not just important that we work together in the NHS, it's equally important that the NHS works really closely with all the other partners across the county, obviously the county council, the district councils, our colleagues in the voluntary and third sector, and the care sector as well. And you may have heard the word, the new sort of lexicon in the NHS is about integrated care. And that is about the NHS working together to provide joined up care for patients, and the NHS and all of our partners working together to deliver much more joined up health and care in the round to the population. And that's really the journey that we are on at the moment. And just to complete the changes in the bureaucracy, as well as everything else that's going on in the health service at the moment, the government is restructuring the NHS. And we anticipate that, subject to legislation passing, a new NHS body will be created from the 1st of April next year, called the Integrated Care NHS Board, which will subsume into it all of the roles and responsibilities that the CCGs have, and take on some additional responsibilities as well. So the NHS Lincolnshire Clinical Commission in group, we anticipate will cease to be come the 1st of April next year, and there'll be a new body, which I think will be called NHS Lincolnshire. So happy to come back to any of that. But I want to talk about the really important things, actually, which isn't about how we organise things, but is what is happening in terms of care to patients in the county, day in, day out, at the moment. Clearly, and I'll not draw too much on the last 18 months, but it has been an immensely traumatic and difficult period for the world, for the country as a whole, and within that, for the NHS in particular. And everything that you've seen on TV about how the NHS has been affected and the work that we've had to do, we have had all that version of it here in the county. Clearly, it's brilliant, isn't it, that society is opening up, the economy is opening up, and we're all either returning to normal or going forward to the next normal. And we've got a way to go, clearly, with that. And we're so proud of the role that we've played in the vaccination programme in terms of getting the country to that point. But within the NHS, the pandemic is still, and its effects are still very, very much with us today. They are massively affecting us, and I anticipate will continue to, in a very sustained level, for at least the next 6 to 9 months, but I suspect actually for quite a few years beyond that. Our NHS staff across the county have done, frankly, an amazing job and continue to day in, day out. But they are understandably fatigued by what they've had to put up with, understandably, and we're doing all we can to support all of our staff and the general practices and our colleagues for the journey ahead into winter, which is undoubtedly going to be really, really difficult for us. So currently, I thought you'd like to know that we still have COVID patients in our hospitals. This morning, we had 61 patients in hospital, COVID patients in hospital. The seven-day rolling average is 57. 5 people have died in our hospitals from COVID since the beginning of the month. In our urgent and emergency care services, this is people who need care quickly, whether it's from their general practice, from the community services, urgent treatment centres, A&E department, or the ambulance service, are currently, frankly, on their knees with the level of demand. So our hospital services have been at what we call OPEL level 4, the highest level of alert now, which until the pandemic was a very rare position to be in for most of the last few weeks. Unfortunately, our ambulance services are waiting for very long periods to discharge patients into our A&E departments. And unfortunately, the number of people who are waiting in our A&E departments for longer than 12 hours, which again, prior to the pandemic, was pretty much a never event in Lincolnshire, is, I'm afraid to say, is more recently been a regular occurrence. So the demand for urgent day in, day out care is huge at the moment. In terms of people waiting for their operation, what we call the elective list, Some hospitals across the country are regularly cancelling operations and have been for a number of weeks now because of the demands of COVID patients in their hospitals or the urgent care demand. ULHT, who obviously run Pilgrim Hospital, are cancelling a few, but they're doing really good work in terms of just trying to hold true to as many of the commitments they're given to patients to have their operations as possible. In July last year, there were 61,000 Lincolnshire people on the waiting list for an operation. In July this year, there are 81,000. That's more than 1 in 10 people in Lincolnshire. Prior to the pandemic, the number of people waiting longer than 52 weeks for an operation was virtually zero. It's currently 2,200 waiting longer than a year. We also, unfortunately, have a small number of patients who are waiting longer than 2 years for their operation. So obviously this is a really, really difficult situation. What ULHT did, if you may recall, is that they put special arrangements in at Grantham Hospital to try to protect cancer care and elective care as much as they could. And they did a superb job with that. So whilst our numbers are truly dreadful, compared to most other systems in England, we compare well. Cancer services, again, working exceptionally hard. We have specific targets to meet in terms of how quickly we can meet urgent cancer care. And I'm pleased to tell you that the services are just about meeting those targets for really urgent care. But there are some specialties in our hospitals that are under real pressure with that. The mental health demand across the county, because you'll have heard how concerned people are of the huge impact of mental health, of the pandemic on people's mental health, actually has gone up, but we're not experiencing yet the significant, it was called tsunami, wasn't it, in the media, of mental health demand from the population. But we are well prepared for that, and there's some really good services in place. Personally, I'm very concerned about children and young people's mental health, and I think that a lot of the issues are yet to probably manifest themselves. Vaccinations, and I'm nearly there. Vaccinations has been an amazing success in our county, here in Boston, across Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire's vaccination programme has consistently exceeded the government's targets. And we are now working really hard on the latest positions. So we're well into 16 and 17-year-old vaccination programme. Currently across Lincolnshire, we're at 61%, having had the first, well, it's their only vaccine, isn't it? That compares to 53% nationally. So good uptake so far. And obviously with the 12 to 15-year-olds and the booster announcement just earlier this week, we are well on with that. We have got a brilliant team who have done a great job across the county. So even though we have far more care homes in Lincolnshire per head of population to just about anywhere else in the country, we were actually amongst the very first in the country to have offered a vaccine to all care home residents. So it's brilliant work to get there. And particularly across the East Coast, that's been a real challenge. So the team's done great work. Our GP services are under immense pressure, and Andrew may choose to have a therapeutic session with you about that. But the GPs are consistently reporting never in careers having been so busy as they are at the moment. And yet we are having to try to communicate to the public who some are expressing frustration about access to GP services. So that's a really tricky point for us. We're looking to the winter, and of course there's the flu vaccination programme. which we're taking forward as per normal as well. And that's actually started across the county now. There are some genuine concerns that flu is going to be more significant over the next 6 months than actually COVID for our population, because we've all lost a bit of immunity to flu because very few of us had it last year. So that's where we are with the services. And then I'll pick up just a couple of other points, and then I'll turn to your questions if I could, please. In fact, some of the questions are about the reconfiguration of hospital services in the county. You may be aware that we've been looking at the configuration of some of our hospital services for quite a number of years recently. We're very close, actually, to starting a public consultation exercise in relation to some of those services. And I just encourage you to keep an eye on the media over the next few weeks or so, and you'll see us launching a public consultation exercise about certain services, not all, but certain services. And then, if I may just turn to the questions. Andrew, I wonder if you would help with the first couple of questions, please. Would it be helpful if I read them out, or do you have them in front of you?
Everyone's got a copy. I was going to suggest that you would take a question at a time, and then anybody who wants to ask a question on that then should be able to do so. So if you'd like a supplementary. So if you want to answer the first question, if any member wishes to ask a supplementary on that, we better take it that way, and we'll move through, if that's okay with you. Is that right?
Thank you, Chair.
Right, so.
Okay, Andrew, would you take the first question then, please?
Okay, I think I'm on. Okay, so the first question is, I'm going to read it because it helps me to answer it. So if a patient at a ULHT hospital is prescribed specific medicines by the hospital after receiving treatment, but upon discharge, the patient's GP medical practice refuses to supply the patient with those particular medicines, who can the patient turn to in order to resolve the situation? It's a complicated answer, actually, because prescribing follows many routes. Prescribing is inherently one of the most dangerous things that a general practitioner undertakes because of the potential interactions between medications patients are taking and their underlying health issues. So in answer to this question, Okay, sorry. Okay, yep.
Oh, is that me?
Okay, right, is that better? Okay, right, thank you. Right, I'm not going to read it again. So what I was going to say is that prescribing is actually quite a dangerous exercise in a medical perspective. And this is because of the interactions with other medicines that the patient may be taking and the other conditions they may have, or conditions that have not yet appeared, which if you prescribe the wrong medication can end up with your patient being seriously ill, and which is something that we spend a lot of time avoiding. And the NHS has spent a lot of money in putting in place systems to stop such events occurring. So in answer to your question, it does depend on how that prescription is originated. Now, if the patient attends outpatients and is told by the consultant, you need this medication, if it's an urgent medication, it's required within the next 7 days, then it should be supplied there and then. Right, so the answer to your question in that situation is that it should actually be supplied in the hospital, and that's where the patient should expect to receive it from. If it's beyond 7 days, it's viewed more as a routine medication, and a notification should be sent to the general practice where that patient is registered, and that practice will then receive that and prescribe accordingly. However, if the practice has a concern about that prescription request, in that they feel it's not compatible for that patient, then it is sensible for them to refuse it, in which case we would normally go back to the consultant who recommended it and say, can we clarify that you really want this medication because of the following reasons? So we would take the responsibility at that time. And because it's a routine medication, the patient should come to no harm. Right? If it's a drug that is what's called a shared care drug, now these are drugs that require a lot of monitoring and potentially are very harmful to patients if not adequately monitored. They must be started by a consultant after an appropriate assessment and a period of being on the drug to be stabilized. Only at that point, when the patient is stabilized on that drug, does the consultant then approach the practice and say, are you prepared to enter a shared care agreement with me over this medication? Now, one of the common ones that we have is a drug called Methotrexate. Now, I don't know if anyone in the room is familiar with Methotrexate, but it's a drug that's used quite widely in rheumatology, dermatology. And it originally was a chemotherapy agent. So any of you who are familiar with chemotherapy will be aware that these drugs can harm your bone marrow. They can affect your white blood cells, and it particularly can also affect your liver. So if the patient is stabilized on it and they're not on other medications that interact that we feel uncomfortable about, we can enter into a shared care agreement. And what this means is that the responsibility around the prescribing and monitoring is shared between the general practitioner and the consultant. But that is at the discretion of the general practitioner, and the general practitioner can decline to be involved in a shared care arrangement. Now, certainly, I can talk within our own practice, we try not to do that because one, it puts pressure on our hospitals. Secondly, it's very inconvenient for patients, right? Trying to obtain prescriptions because the systems are much easier to interact with in general practice, which I think you've all found, haven't you? You know, if you're not getting anywhere with something health related, where do you go? You go to your general practice, right? But not all practices in town enter into the shared care arrangement, and their patients will receive their prescriptions directly from the hospital. If a patient is discharged from the hospital after an emergency stay, they should come with 7 days of medication, because whilst you've been in hospital, the doctors there have looked at you, made new diagnoses, instituted new treatment, and a discharge letter should come to the GP. Now, that again, there's a 7-day window because the patient should come with 7 days of that new medication. We then put it onto the computer and then the patient can continue with that medication. Sometimes that system breaks down, right? For whatever reasons. We all know that bits of paper go astray. We know that someone doesn't press the right button on the computer. And we sometimes end up in a position where we have a patient who says, I'm on the following medication, and we don't have a verification list. And that's a professional judgment. And that's down to each individual practitioner as to what they feel is the best thing to do in that situation. There's a balance between do no harm versus doing good, right? And where you are as a GP in your career and your level of experience will influence your willingness to tolerate a certain amount of risk and uncertainty in measuring those up. So that's my sort of short version to the question that you asked me. I'm quite happy to take any questions about prescribing if you wish.
I will dive in first because that was my question. Actually, the first 10 are my questions, and they are real life questions. It's not dreamt up. The concern I have is sometimes there isn't the right kind of level of communication between hospital and GP practice. That's the thing I'm picking up. There's not the right. There's not the right communication between the GP practice and the hospital. Do you hear that? Yep, that's the issue. The first 10 questions are my questions, and they come out. They're real life questions. They're not dreamt up. They are real life questions that have come to me. So the question then is, what if the communication between the hospital and the GP breaks down, what happens to the patient?
Again, it depends on the scenario. And I've listed some of the scenarios that we face. But ultimately, the decision to issue a prescription lies with the person who signs the prescription. And if that person doesn't have enough information to safely prescribe and feels that the risk is too high to issue a prescription in that situation, it is appropriate for them to decline that prescription and refer it back to the person who requested it.
I accept your answer, and I think it's reasonable. The only thing that sometimes patients are left in limbo because of it, that's a problem. That's where this has arisen from. To say it's a live question. I'll open it now to anybody else who wants to make a statement. So, Councillor David Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Andrew, I can't see your name there, so if you don't mind, I'll call you Dr. Andrew. And I recognise that most probably. I recognise you're a GP, and I'm not here to browbeat you as a GP offering a GP service in the town. But you mentioned that anybody coming into hospital care for, I think you said emergency, should then go and see their GP within 7 days. That's a little bit hard to do at the moment. I'm not trying to bash GPs. I had an appointment with my GP on Tuesday that took 3 weeks to get. I was offered a phone consultation. I was offered a locum, which I declined, and I was prepared to wait the 3 weeks. So we're in this situation. Obviously, COVID has affected all this. But when you say that, come and see your GP within 7 days, I'm afraid that's pretty hard to actually do. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, I'll respond to that. If I haven't made it clear, I didn't say come and see your GP in 7 days. And that's possibly that I didn't give you enough information, is that when there's a request for a prescription to be issued in 7 days' time, what we will do is we will generate that prescription on the details that were given to us by the hospital. We will then ask our reception team to contact the patient and tell them that the prescription has been issued for them. Right? If we have a question or we are uncertain and we feel we need to talk to the patient, then in the past, we would have said, come in. At the moment, we would do a telephone consultation in that situation. So I'm sorry if I've misled you there.
If I may, please, Chairman, the fault is mine. I didn't understand the difference between collecting a prescription and actually going physically in to see your GP.
Does anybody else wish to ask a question on that?
Chairman, Simon Evans and Councillor Wellborn both have their hands raised.
All right, well, Judy, do you want to say?
Yeah, I have had a few instances recently of people who are non-English speaking being in hospital for 2 or 3 days, coming out with instructions given to them in English as to make an appointment to see your doctor, make an appointment to see so-and-so, go to your pharmacy. They have no idea, honestly, no idea what to do. They are having to seek help from a third person, which is often 3 or 4 days after they've been discharged without any type of medication or help. Can somebody please just make sure that when they're dealing with people who are not English speaking, that they give them stuff in their own language so that they know what to do, where to go and what's happening, because I think we're going to end up with loss of life because people just don't understand our system. Thank you.
Chairman, we seem to have lost sound from the Guildhall.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you.
So shouting does work. Right.
I was going to say Simon Evans, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Hospital Trust, who's with us on screen. I wonder, Simon, if you'd be able to make a comment, please.
Over to you, Simon.
Yes, thank you for that. So as John says, I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at ULHT. I'm also what we call the SRO, the Senior Executive responsible for planned care across all the providers across Lincolnshire. So just very specifically in response to your comment there, Councillor Wellborn, just around language, we do have multiple language users in our hospitals at different times, and we use a variety of both face-to-face and also a language line and different materials to be able to communicate with people. Some of the materials that we send out with patients, particularly around medication, will be confusing because they will be using drug names of various things. But where there are instructions to seek further advice, that should really be given in a language that they understand. And also we should seek confirmation that they understand the next bit of their pathways. So if you do have examples, if there are examples of people that you know, very happy to pick those up through our PALS service and examine that. And I'll also take that through to our patient group. And in our patient expert patient group, we also have a number of non-English native speakers in that group as well, where we can explore where if somewhere in that discharge process this might be going wrong. I think the other thing to say, Chair, is the examples potentially that drove some of the first question you had around our interface with primary care, and I agree with absolutely everything that my learned colleague described in terms of those responsibilities. But if there are particular cases behind this, again, we're very keen to understand those either through information through us or to our PALS service, so that we can explore them in more detail to make sure that we're not missing some process or something more substantial in the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you for that explanation. Thank you very much, Simon. If we move on perhaps to the next question, unless anybody else wants to comment on what's been said. No? Well, I don't want to do that because otherwise people might get lost on the meeting. I don't want a collective answer. You have a question, Mr. Chairman? Yes. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is question to Mr. Turner. It's just you mentioned the 1.3 billion, which is the county gets from the taxpayers. I have I think 3 questions for you, if you can answer me those questions. Does the budget, or this 1.3 billion, does it vary each year, or is it the same for each year, year after year? That's one question. Second one, if you have the figures, can you tell us how much of that goes in salaries? And the third one, do we have any shortages in doctors and nurses at the moment? Thank you.
Very happy to take those questions. In terms of the 1.3 billion, that's roughly the sum that we are allocated. You might have noticed over the past few years, we've been spending more than the amount of money that we're allocated. Roughly, prior to the pandemic, 100 million pounds a year more than that. So the health service in the county has been overspending its budget for many, many years. Does it change year on year? Yes, all allocations change, sometimes in year as well. But essentially they're uplifted for inflation, drug costs go up, pay costs go up, and there is also a national allocation formula that looks at different factors that drive demand for health services. Obviously, the number of people living in an area, relative levels of deprivation, economic health, and so on. And actually, a couple of years ago, that allocation formula was adjusted to give a greater weighting to populations living in coastal areas. So Lincolnshire, particularly the East, did get a little bit of an uplift to its allocation on the basis of that. In terms of where we spend money, I mean, essentially, about 70% of all of the money that the NHS receives broadly goes on salaries, goes on staff. The NHS essentially is people, isn't it? It's people delivering care. The other costs, the other spends goes on obviously drugs and other consumables and on buildings. Heat, light, power, and maintenance, and all of the rest of it. So that's where the money really goes. NHS staff, consumables generally, but drugs in particular, and then the cost of buildings. So hopefully that's clear enough. Yeah. Sandra's from a finance background. Have I covered it okay?
Yeah, you covered it well.
Did all right. Thank you.
How about the third question, which is, do we have a shortage of doctors and nurses?
Yeah, absolutely we do. We have for a number of years. We in England do, and we in Lincolnshire do. So I don't know if Simon might have some figures or not for the hospital trust, but in terms of numbers. But for example, I know that United Lincolnshire Hospital Trust every year spends between 40 and 50 million pounds on agency and locum costs to cover vacancies in the service. There are some specialties where we'd struggle to get the specialist doctors. That's the case in England. It is the case in Lincolnshire. So there is a national NHS workforce shortage. And again, I think before the pandemic, the country was short of nurses. Was it about 100,000 nurses in the country? And we have slightly more than our fair share of that in Lincolnshire. Yes, particularly hospital doctors. So again, there are specialties in ULHT where, for example, there may be 8 consultant posts in a specialty, and I'll bring Simon in a moment, where only 1 or 2 of those are permanent members of staff, and the other posts are filled by locum or agency doctors.
I know that, yeah.
In general practice as well, Andrew may wish to comment, but recruiting new GPs into the county is a real challenge. We're just about holding our own, but again, there is a shortage of GPs across the country. You might recall that prior to the pandemic, there was a significant initiative to expand the number of GPs in England, and that was actually picking up a bit of momentum prior to the pandemic. I wonder, Chair, if Simon could come in from a hospital perspective, and Andrew, you may wish to comment from a GP perspective.
Well, I'm sure there are members. It could become a difficult meeting if members can't ask their questions.
Okay.
But well, no, I'm going to ask Councillor Skinner. You have a question, don't you?
I do, Chair. Thank you. Through you. Just as we were talking about budget, one of my main questions was about the budget. I believe that you're applying for funding for the mental health side to move to another site, and I'm told that at the moment they contribute about £1 million worth to Pilgrim's budget. So how is Pilgrim going to remain sustainable without this vital contribution?
Please, yes.
I don't know the specifics around that that change that you've highlighted in terms of the detailed planning arrangements around that. Simon may be able to make a comment, but what I would wish to say to you is that Pilgrim Hospital is obviously a vital asset for the NHS in Lincolnshire and very clearly for the people in Boston and the surrounding areas. There is absolute commitment to Pilgrim Hospital from the NHS authorities. And a good example of that is actually our intentions to redevelop the A&E department in the county. You'll be aware that Boris Johnson, again before the pandemic, visited and made a commitment to a new A&E department. We've been working on that in detail. We're actually topping up the national investment that Boris announced with additional local capital resource. And that, I believe, will be the biggest ever investment for a single project within ULHT's history. So that's just a signal, I think, of our commitment to Boston Hospital. I'm sure you'll understand that services do ebb and flow a little bit in terms of the best possible configuration of them. But I want to just emphasise the commitment to the hospital, its staff and its service to the people of Boston and the surrounding area. Chair, could I ask Simon to comment on the specific question?
Just 1 minute. Councillor Skinner, are you happy with what you've heard so far? Or did you want to come back to John Turner on that?
If Simon can give a bit more
if you're happy with that?
More detailed answer, I would like to hear that, Chair.
That's
I
fine.
do feel they've rather evaded the question.
I want to make sure that councillors have the chance, otherwise it becomes dominated by officers and then you have few questions answered. And that's not the intention of the evening. Simon Evans, can you come in and support John Turner, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for that. So actually the removal of those services physically will support the expansion of Pilgrim acute services enormously, and actually will probably play into the future of Pilgrim Hospital much more as we're able to expand more and more using a greater element of the estate. The 1 million, although it sounds like a very significant amount of money, it is when you look at the overall £500 million finances of the trust isn't something that will destabilise, but actually on a very practical level, the ability for us to be able to expand our acute services at Pilgrim will require moving into some of those areas which were previously used by our colleagues in mental health, and will help us as we have to respond to the challenges of COVID, which not only are very staff intensive, but are also very physically demanding on our estates, having to use more and more physical space so that we're able to provide the necessary infection prevention and control measures. So it's actually a very beneficial thing for us, and as a system is something we're planning for.
How do you feel about that, Judith?
Thank you. I feel somewhat more reassured, Chair.
Right. Okay, that's very good. I know that Councillor Katie Chalmers wanted to make a statement. Also, Tom Ashton also wanted to say something. Katie, would you come forward and you can borrow a mic, I'm sure.
I've got 2 questions. When or are all the NHS services going to reopen, or are they all reopen? And you said about the increase of backlog of people waiting for operations and what would have been classed pre-COVID as urgent treatment that have now been put onto a backlog. How are we going to clear that backlog, and what kind of time frame are you expecting that to take? That's it.
Thank you for the question. All NHS services in the county are reopen. Many have stayed open throughout the pandemic. If there's a specific service that you have in mind, please do just signal that. But to the very best of my knowledge, all NHS services are reopened, so to speak, the vast majority of which never closed throughout the pandemic.
Can I just come in on that? Yeah. I think Katie has a view on that.
Thank you. Specifically, our GP has deferred treatment, saying that the services at the hospital, the testing and the laboratory works are closed for those particular things. But blood tests, yeah, is one, yeah.
Okay. There has been a completely separate issue recently about blood tests, which you may have seen in the media, which is linked to the supply of blood bottles to the country and the NHS across the county as well. So it may be, if it's a recent issue related to that, again, if there's a specific concern about a specific patient episode, we would be delighted to pick that up from you and look into it. Again, could I ask Simon, please, from the hospital, if he has any comment in relation to that, as it is a hospital service?
Simon, are you there? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, so thank you. It is exactly as John's described. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Yes, it is exactly as John's described. A number of routine and screening tests have been delayed. So they haven't been completely stopped, but they have been delayed to reduce the demand on the blood bottles, which is the international shortage. It's not just limited to the UK, but an international shortage of a particular type of blood bottle. I'm pleased to say that as of tomorrow, the services are restarting again. So those routine services and some of those screening tests will commence again from tomorrow because of the increased supply from the United States. Not COVID related in this particular case. It was very much around a particular supply.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that explanation. Can I turn to Councillor Tom Ashton, if that's all right? Pardon? You got another question? All right.
Sorry, I'd asked a couple other questions. There was a backlog of people waiting for operations. How are we going to clear the backlog, and what is your expected time frame?
Simon, can you answer those questions for us?
Thank you.
Did you hear them?
Yes, I did. Thank you very much. The first one, in terms of how we're addressing the backlog, we are doing a wide range of things which would take much of the time tonight, so I won't go, but perhaps some of the most significant elements. We are using and working very closely with our independent sector, so that's the private sector, health colleagues. Many people across the county will be currently experiencing operations being carried out in our private hospitals under NHS care, and that has expanded more and more and will continue to be for some time. That gives us in the NHS a large amount of additional capacity, so we can start to catch up. In addition to that, as we described, as John talked about earlier on, Grantham Hospital has become essentially an elective hub for a large amount of activity which protects patients from a heightened risk of COVID in our other hospitals, because of the way that we're able to isolate that. It was very successful throughout wave 1 and wave 2. I'm pleased to say no one contracted COVID perioperatively, so that's having had their procedure during that period, and there was only one of very few centres in the country, if not the world, that was able to provide that safe service. We're carrying on with that. We're increasing the number of cases whilst COVID is at a very high level in the community, and then services will then equally redistribute as COVID dissipates in our hospitals and returns back to hospitals. I'm afraid I can't give you the $1 million question, which is when we will have worked through those all of that backlog. Currently, there is a lot of national planning being done to understand just how long and what kind of national efforts need to be put into place to support what we're doing locally, and we're hoping that certainly over the course of the next few weeks we're going to release the next stage of our plan for the second half of the year, which will start to articulate a trajectory and the likely timescales for when we'll be able to work through all of that backlog. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you. Is that all right, Katie? Well, maybe it's not all right, but it's an answer, isn't it? It's an answer. I must go to Tom Ashton. I'm sorry to keep waiting, Tom.
Not at all, Mr. Chairman. And actually, Katie's line of questioning largely replicates what I was intending myself. I mean, these are questions that I'd got in mind for the end of the long list, and given the line of conversation that we've just had, I felt this was an appropriate moment to raise them rather than wait until the conversation had moved on. So not wishing to tread entirely over ground that's just been covered, we're aware that there's obviously a national workforce shortage, that there have been vacancies that long predate COVID. And you just explained, I think, that the principal route to a solution of clearing that backlog in waiting lists and so on that we're familiar with is through making use of the private sector. Does the private sector have sufficient capacity to clear this backlog in a realistic amount of time? And we've heard an awful lot recently about increases in national insurance to cover both social care and initially NHS recovery. So what precisely does this money provide in Lincolnshire? What do we get in exchange of this money in Lincolnshire? Is it simply buying more private operation to help clear that backlog? Is this something that we foresee in the long term? Is this the long-term solution? Or even post clearing that backlog to the workforce shortages and vacancies that we had before COVID. And I think I would leave it there, because I was going to ask how long do we anticipate it being before the backlog is cleared, but I think the answer is already said, we really don't know yet. But if you could just fill in the gaps on what I've asked there, I'd be very grateful, please.
Simon, I think that's for you.
Thank you, and thank you for the question there. Just on vacancies, yes, we do have a substantial number of vacancies, and as you said, before COVID, we went into a position as a trust with a substantial number of vacancies, but we have made real progress in a couple of really critical areas for us, particularly in urgent care. We have made more progress over the course, ironically, over the course of the last year and a half in terms of filling vacancies than we have had for the last half a decade. So it is starting to turn the tide of some of the issues with vacancies, but it won't necessarily address this backlog in a short term. The independent sector, we've worked with for as long as I've been in Lincolnshire, but on very small scales. So there have been relatively few operations, and it would be on an individual case basis that we would have much of those conversations. We've now turned that into a very different dialogue, and much of that's been driven nationally in terms of contracts that have been made with many of the independent sector providers. That has moved away now to a more regional approach, but we've continued that same ethos. Now in Lincolnshire, we don't have a huge amount of independent sector capacity. Some systems in like Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire have much larger private hospitals with a much broader spectrum of operations that they can undertake. And we are working with some of those for areas where we have particular difficulties in terms of being able to operate within a time scale that we deem as critical for that patient's care. But nevertheless, the independent sector capacity that we have already managed to identify and that we're working with will make a substantial improvement in our overall backlog, and over the course of the next couple of years, that will be a sizable percentage of every operation that's carried out in Lincolnshire. We'll, as I said, unfortunately, I can't give you a timescale. One of the contributing factors to that is that wave 3, which we're currently in, as John has described, is having as big an impact as wave 2, even with half the numbers. And that's not just for Lincolnshire. Actually, we're faring better than many other systems, but across the region, we are seeing requests for mutual aid. That's to be able to support other systems who are in critical difficulties. And Lincolnshire, we're having to do that and have had to do that on a regular basis in order to protect life and limb. hopefully that answers the questions that you asked there. Apologies if I've missed any out.
Tom, do you want to go?
Yes, thank you very much for that. That does cover most of the points that I was seeking an answer to. One thing that you mentioned there in respect of private provision, most of it being located outside of Lincolnshire. Does it make any difference where that's located in order for Lincolnshire to have fair access to it? Appreciating if it's in Nottinghamshire or Peterborough, do we have as much call on that resource from Lincolnshire as, for example, NHS colleagues in Nottingham or Peterborough or Derby or wherever they might be?
Thank you. We don't have as much
Simon?
sway. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So we don't have as much sway on centres in other systems as we do in Lincolnshire. So when we're having to work with Nottinghamshire and to our north, closer to Scunthorpe and to our south in Peterborough, they are more difficult conversations for us because we won't be at the top of the list in terms of their prioritisation. However, we have managed to establish good links with them, and we do have patients in particular where the geography makes absolute sense to provide access for those patients, thinking about health inequalities and making sure that we don't have people having to travel the length and breadth of Lincolnshire for their operation. We are able to offer some services closer where they might be on our boundaries of, say, Peterborough and other North Links and Gaul, but we don't have quite this way that we do for the centres that we have in Boston itself and in Lincoln itself.
Right. Tom, how do you feel about that? Are you happy with what you've heard? Or
I'm grateful for the response, but I think it is something that, and I'm sure the Health Scrutiny Committee for Lincolnshire will be very much on this. It certainly feels, to my mind, to be something we need to be incredibly vigilant of, that Lincolnshire doesn't find itself at the back of the queue for catching up. And clearing that backlog simply by nature of geography. If the principle of the NHS is effectively fair and equal access for all, then simply because we don't have any private, we don't have a Nottingham or a Peterborough within Lincolnshire, I wouldn't want that to disadvantage our population.
I think it's such a key point. I think we do need to have a firm answer from everyone on that. Lincolnshire has the same rights as everywhere else in the country. I think it's very key. And this comes up at health scrutiny all the time in relation to various different areas of our provision that we're not getting actually what I think we should be. Now, I actually have a question which is not on the list actually. So I'm going to throw this one at you, all right? But I actually better not, because I have Councillor Yvonne Stevens in front of me, and I daren't let her down. So would you go?
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a question, and it's right to the heart of the issues with in Pilgrim Hospital. And my question is, what do you think, and be specific if you can, what is the worst case scenario of the restructuring government plans to do, and how it will affect Boston's Pilgrim's Hospital?
Key question. Who wants to answer that?
Could I just clarify which restructuring plans do you mean? Do you mean when I talked about the? Okay.
Well, there's urology, isn't there, for one, and then there are others.
Right, I think the question was specifically about the government's restructuring of the NHS. Am I correct? Yeah. Okay.
What I wanted was your thoughts on the departments in Pilgrim Hospital that's going to get the axe.
I wonder if Simon could come in on this one. I don't want to repeat, but I'm happy to, the commitment statement that I made earlier to the vital asset that Pilgrim Hospital is to the community here and to the NHS in the county.
Simon, as the question's for you to answer.
Okay.
Did you hear what Yvonne had to say?
I did. I'm not sure I'm
hear-
able to translate it really in terms of our current plans. So in terms of what we're planning at ULHT for the future of Boston Hospital, it's a continued expansion of bigger and better services, essentially. I think we started by saying the greatest investment in the history of our organisation is going into Boston over the course of the next few years. The emergency department is going to double and a bit more in terms of its size. And in order for an emergency service to run effectively in that way, it will have to have state-of-the-art services that plug into it behind it. And all of our 5-year strategy in terms of our improvement plan align the services with that in mind. We aren't expecting to make substantial closures of service that detract from any of that. However, we are, of course, looking to make sure that we continue our focus on centres of excellence, and that where we can centralise services, where we can improve outcomes for patients, we will do that, making sure that we don't detract from health inequalities and access. And an example of that is the sort of desire to want to do greater degrees of more complex surgery over at Boston. And at the moment, as it currently stands, we are probably conducting more complex surgeries at Boston, just because of the nature of the capacity and the impact of wave 3 than we are at Lincoln at times. So I'm sorry if that's a kind of very vague statement. I'm not quite sure what the sort of overall changes and restructures at a government level would necessarily have an impact on our plan as it currently stands.
I think.
Can I come back,
yes,
Chairman,
I think
please?
so. I would just want to say that we are very concerned about local changes to our hospital. That's the thing that's coming.
Yes.
Yvonne,
Thank you, Chairman.
off you go.
You spoke about centralisation, and in centralisation, if I'm correct, then it means that we won't have it in Boston. This is what I was trying to get an answer to. Let's presume, I'll take for an example, you're going to close the eye department because you're going to centralise it at Grantham or Lincoln. That's the questions I'm asking. I want to know where the centralisation will be, perhaps down to and because of the government restructuring, because you've got to have an idea because it's your business, you know it, and I want to know where you think the centralisation is going to happen or the closures. But I liked what you said previously, because how you answered me initially was, it made me feel that there was no closures coming, but then you mentioned the word centralisation.
Chair, do you want me to answer? Yep. Okay.
Yes, please answer. Yes, please, Simon.
So in terms of changes to service, whenever we embark on any kind of change to service, as John explained right at the beginning in terms of acute services review, there will be a long period of us debating what are the merits and a consultation that goes with that. And that is ultimately how we will describe any changes in the organisation going forward. We have a legal duty to do that, and of course we will absolutely engage and involve the public in its broadest sense with any changes that we put in place. Closures and centralisation are different types of things for me, and apologies if I'm using them interchangeably. They should be quite different things. If we look, for example, at changes that we've made over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, the development of the cardiac service, which was a centralised service, and the development of major trauma as an example. both of which were nationally driven, but of course we locally implemented that in our hospitals. And for those services, we designated Lincoln Hospital as our primary cardiac centre, and both Lincoln and Boston both became trauma centres, so neither of which became a major trauma centre. So they were centralised in a way. However, Boston continues to operate a cardiac service and still cares for cardiac patients, and we still care for trauma patients. We stabilise them and often will repatriate patients back to Boston. But what they get from that is they get access to specialised expertise 24/7 in a way that we could never deliver at a single site without that kind of centralisation approach. So that's quite different to stopping a service where obviously we wouldn't provide any trauma or any cardiac, for example. And there are some of those services that we've stopped in the past, maternity, for example, at Grantham, and they are closures of service. At the moment, we're not looking in terms of full closures of service and any description of that and any plans to do that, you would hear through a consultation involvement exercise that I've explained. I hope that helps.
Well, Yvonne, does it come somewhere to
Well,
answer?
I've heard a lot of words, Chairman, but I haven't got a reply to what I asked. But I accept the words that's been said, and obviously this is a wait and see situation.
Yes, it's not dissimilar to being on Health Scrutiny Committee in Lincoln. You sometimes get lost in the words. I'm going to ask Councillor Alison Austin if she would like to come in.
Thank you, Chairman. This probably is aimed then at Simon, because I want to pick up one comment that you made, but then I also want to ask about one specific service. So the question relating to what you said double in size, and that was referring, I think, to your emergency. Now, double in size physically, or hopefully staffing as well, because it's no use doubling in size if they don't go hand in hand. And my second question, so you can think about it, I'm particularly interested in the thought that I hope you're always going to keep a stroke unit here in Boston, because the thought of someone going over to Lincoln if they've had a stroke, then by the time they've got there, it may not be soon enough. Thank you.
In response to your first question, it will actually be more than double in size, but the emergency department, which contains the sort of majors area and the resus areas, the most acute elements, will be doubling in size. In terms of workforce, over the course of the last year, we've added about 20% already to the workforce, and that's through a degree of both recruitment, but also an expansion in the number of people that we hire through agencies and the use of our bank and additional hours. And every year we do a review to look at the workforce that we have and to match that against the demands on the services that come through, and we adjust it accordingly. Often it's not a big adjustment, but obviously impact of COVID, we've had to make a substantial change, and we actually made a substantial change just going into COVID as well to reflect the growth in emergency demand. So I can say with some confidence it is both grow in physical size, but we've also grown in workforce as well as that. The other thing to say is that the new department won't just be ULHT. We work very closely with our partners in LCHS and our community health service provider colleagues. We work hand in glove really in our emergency departments, and they run our UTCs, our urgent treatment centres, and those treatment centres have actually been seeing more and more patients than ever before, really, and will sometimes take up to 50% of the people who arrive at our emergency department, see them and treat them very effectively, very rapidly, and then interface with our primary care colleagues to care for them after that as well. In terms of your second question, from a stroke perspective, we're currently operating already a stroke model where the hyperacute service patients are taken to Lincoln, and have done now throughout the COVID pandemic. And that has been shown actually to improve access for some patients who required the hyperacute element of that service. That's the where people need to have an urgent CT and then they're potentially thrombolyzed. And we've been working with Peterborough and EMAS colleagues throughout COVID in order to protect that service and to maintain that access. However, in terms of consultation about any changes, that would be a public exercise. That will be my colleagues in the room with you there that would lead on any consultation in terms of changes of services going forward.
Alison, are you how do you feel about that?
Well, from the accident, yeah, that's okay. From the stroke point of view, well, I think most of you know why I've asked this question. I think I perhaps will just say no further comment. Thank you.
I think that's very good. I mean, these are key issues. The issue is really about the services that are supplied at Pilgrim Hospital. And we're aware of the national circumstances, but it is the local concerns I have. I was actually going to ask Councillor Jonathan Noble if he'd like to offer a question, because he's sitting there very patiently. You have provided certain questions on the list, and I think you should be given that opportunity to speak. So I'm going to call you in.
Thank you, Chair. I'll endeavour to be brief. Some of the questions I've posed have already been answered, which was the role of the clinical commissioning groups and why it was reduced in Lincolnshire from 4 to 1. So I'm going to start by asking, this is related to question 14, what was the death rate per 100 inpatients at the Pilgrim Hospital in 2020 as a percentage figure? That's question 14.
Simon, can you answer?
I can answer that. So, but before I do, I'm going to have to say an important caveat. What you've asked for there is what we call the crude death rate. And the crude death rate does not consider for any changes in the expected death rate because of comorbidities or the health of patients in any particular area. Now that might sound like a management get out of why it might be different, but it is a very important feature in the NHS. And when we benchmark across our organisations, we use an indicator called the hospital standardised mortality ratio. And what that does is look at patients and the illness that they have before they go into hospital and during a hospital, and then consider whether those patients were at a high risk of death when they were going in. And that's so you can compare different regions, different levels of deprivation and comorbidities equally. With that aside, the crude death rate for United Lincolnshire hospitals during that period is 2.5%, and for Pilgrim Hospital it was 3.3% during that period.
Thank you. Just running on from that, I was doing some research this afternoon. Hospital trusts with the worst, i.e. higher than expected death rates. And top of the list is Colchester Hospital University Trust with 4,473. But United Lincolnshire Hospital Trust comes second with 3,704 deaths. So these are fairly disappointing figures. So how do you explain that very poor figure, and what are you going to do to alleviate or improve it?
In terms of the way that mortality is examined, as I've said, there's the hospital standardised mortality rate. There's also what we call the SHMI, which is standardised hospital mortality indicator. They consider different things in the way that patients are classified as whether they are a hospital or whether they are patients who die some time after hospital, but potentially as a result of hospital. There is a significant difference between the two United Lincolnshire hospitals. One, as you identify, describes an excess death rate very high, the other one much less so. In terms of the work that we've done over recent years, up to going into COVID, actually our hospital standardised mortality ratio had dropped down to is expressed as a percentage or as an indices of 100, between 100 and 106, which actually placed us not in an average across the country, but certainly not a significant outlier, whereas our other indicators did show that we were an outlier. The work that we've been undertaking ties into the improvement in quality that we've been working with the CQC over the last 2.5 years. You'll know that United Lincolnshire Hospitals is a trust of special measures, and was described before COVID and was indicated on the KEO list even as far back, I think, as 2014. Since then, we have made a number of improvements, substantial improvements, and the CQC have removed a number of the conditions that they stipulated as areas of major concerns, one of which is around our elements of our children's services, which is called a section 29. And we've also made substantial progress on our urgent care as well, where we're hoping to announce shortly that we will have a number of those in sections and enforcement elements removed as well. So that reflects that we have made substantial progress in terms of improving the quality of our services, and that will have an impact in terms of mortality. I think the thing that we can't ignore is that over the last 1.5 years, we have seen the greatest challenge probably ever recorded or experienced in the history of our organisation and potentially in the history of the NHS. And that has had a toll on many of our services, our staff, our workforce, and will have an impact for some time to come in terms of our ability to recover from the impact of that in Lincolnshire.
Thank you, Chair. I'll endeavour to pick my questions because I appreciate lots of other people want to ask questions. So I'm going to go on to question 20. Why is it deemed essential to have so many levels of bureaucracy? Because I noted from what Mr. Turner said earlier, he did identify some of the levels of bureaucracy, but not all, because I know there were sustainability and transformation partnerships, STPs, there are integrated care systems, ICSs. We've also got the role of NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and obviously we've also have the Care Quality Commission, which I appreciate maybe not part of the NHS. So why do we need so many levels of bureaucracy? Because to the outsider, it seems excessive. Could it not be more effectively rationalised?
Can I come into that? Because, of course, we did have 4 CCGs and now we have 1. So there's an awful logic in Council Nable's question, isn't it? Reduce the amount of bureaucracy in theory, I suppose, by having 1. I have to add that a certain senior officer in the CCGs, Andy Ricks, did say to me 10 years ago when I said, why don't we have 1 CCG? He said, oh, it's impossible. Impossible. Could never happen. It's like herding cats. Couldn't happen. Well, we have 1 now, so herding cats must be possible.
Chair, sorry, with your excuse, I think Mr. Turner was keen to answer that question, actually.
Yeah, and clearly, what we all want is the most amount of our resource as possible being available to deliver direct patient care on the front line. So the responsibility of us who aren't involved in direct patient care is to ensure that our operations and the way which to deliver our planning and commissioning responsibilities are as light as they possibly can be, So, for example, when we reduced or merged the 4 CCGs into one, here in Lincolnshire, which is an initiative that we took here in Lincolnshire, we took 20% out of the running costs of the CCG functions in the county. NHS is full of jargon, but essentially the ST, so the Sustainability and Transformation Plan and Partnership and the Integrated Care System is part and parcel of what the CCG currently does and will be doing going into the future as we develop into this integrated care system. So that is not an additional layer of bureaucracy, it's an additional responsibility, if you like, that I, as CCG Chief Executive, have to discharge. The bureaucracy, if you like, above me in the rest of the system, I can describe. I've got my own views on parts of that as well. Clearly, the CQC have a responsibility in terms of inspecting the quality of care, and that's a vitally important responsibility. They are a national body. NICE have a responsibility in terms of standards of clinical excellence that they expect the NHS to deliver. So that clearly is a very important function as well. As part of the reorganisation of the NHS that I mentioned in my opening comments, whilst there isn't a specific target that's been set in terms of reducing spend on bureaucracy, I think there are significant opportunities to again squeeze that down a little bit. We've gone a long way in Lincolnshire already. We can go further, but as you can imagine, every time we try to reduce that, additional asks are made of us by our regulators, by NHS England, and by the government as well. So it's that continuous balance, but the core intention is always to get as much resource into the front line as we possibly can.
Thank you. And my next question is 21, sorry, Chair.
Jonathan, could I just ask, because I know that Judith Skinner wants to ask a question as well. Could I ask her to come in and then you follow up? Is that possible? Okay, Judith, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to combine these two questions into one because they sort of overlap a little bit. I've been looking at your integrated improvement plan for 2020 to 25 and the bit on neurology, which I noticed the survey is now closed. And it says there, if a condition cannot be stabilised and the patient is not fit for transfer, they would be admitted to Pilgrim and an on-call consultant would be required to attend that location. Would that mean that the consultant would come from Lincoln? And if you've got an enlarged A&E department, what would happen to to complicated catheters for other patients and inpatients? What about patient choice? And also on surveys, this is a bit of a story. I was pleased to see on the weekly leaders briefing that the NHS Link CCG were to have a stall on Boston Market last Saturday, part of which was to allow residents the option to give their views on the future service at the sidings. I took the time to visit the stall and spoke to a very nice lady from the Boston Health visiting team. We discussed how her service was coping. Not once did she mention the opportunity to do this survey. And my point of this story is that you may put on these events and put surveys out, but they do not seem to be very well organised or publicised with the desire to get residents' views. Call me cynical, but it looks like a tick box exercise. As I do feel so many before, because I have completed these surveys in the past and found that they lead the participant with the options of answers with little space for free-form comments. If I'm to believe that ULHT really cares about what the people of Boston think about these things, changes that are going on, how are you going to improve this and increase Bostonians' participation in these surveys? Thank you.
There's quite a lot there. I hope, who wants to answer it?
Simon on urology and Sandra will pick up the siding survey and listening to local views.
That's fair enough. I mean, I think the urology side is very, very concerning since, as you probably know, the I think it's that the weekend service will be dealt with entirely at Lincoln, and and the emergency service, isn't it? Is going to be transferred to Lincoln. So it only means that operations that are planned will actually happen at Boston. Am I correct? I think on that. Well, I'm sure Simon would answer that. I think I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about the shift of stuff to Lincoln. Simon?
Thank you for that, Chair.
Simon?
You're right. Can you hear me?
Well, yes, perfectly well.
Okay, thank you. You are quite right in terms of the changes to urology have the emergency service running at Lincoln. In terms of the description that colleague described around a urology consultant having to attend Boston, as it currently stands, in terms of the current model and the how the consultant workforce are distributed, that often that would be the case that consultants would have to be coming across the county and both ways, because the service historically moved from one site to another, and as part of the consultation, the description of some of the difficulties was that constant moving around, and moving urologists around in particular was a huge issue in terms of being able to safely deliver the service. In terms of the proposition, this was developed by the urology team, and after examining exactly how the service could be effectively delivered for the greatest level of patient care. So this wasn't a managerial discussion. This was one that was developed by clinicians in terms of getting the best outcomes for patients, and also recognising that a great number of patients were being cancelled electively, who required, in some cases, quite urgent operations because of that issue of the mixed emergency provision. And this model will actually greatly improve access for patients that require urgent urology planned operations for Boston, and will have a far less cancellation rate for those patients as part of this the model that's been put forward. I hope that answers your question.
Right. Well, Judith, do you want to come back on that?
So that confirms that the consultant, if they can't be stabilised and have to go to Pilgrim, the consultant would have to travel to Pilgrim.
That has been. It is the shortage of consultants that really undermines the service, I feel. That's really the whole problem of it. And I do feel that the service is huge, or the NHS is huge, but the really key people, there aren't enough of them. So we've obviously got a real problem over training. I did actually want to ask a question myself, actually. It was passed to me, and it says, it talks about where is the assessment of impact on other services and on patients arising for urology proposal? We had the positives presented in the public consultation, but where is the full assessment so public can give an informed response? And in brackets it says, remembering that initially this was a major flaw in the 2018 proposals for children's services, there was a failure to consider the impact on maternity and neonatal provision when the decision to withdraw pediatric trainees was made. So have lessons been learned? So it comes back to where is the full assessment? So the public can give an informed response. That's come from someone who's not in this room. Simon, do you want to go for that one?
Thank you. I would like to correct the second part of that statement in terms of a comparison to children's services. The decision to remove paediatric trainees was not part of any proposal. In fact, it was a consequence of Health Education England, who decided that they were going to remove the trainees on a number of issues, but not solely and not related to the proposition that be put forward. And I'm pleased to say they've reversed that decision now, and all of the trainees are now back and returning to our hospitals for those services. I think it's important because there are always elements that can't be predicted as terms of change. However, the propositions that we put forward describe the risk of undertaking these and the relative benefits. And indeed, we wouldn't put them forward if we didn't feel, certainly clinically, that there were more benefits than outweighed some of the risks that were associated to them. In terms of urology, there has been careful consideration and long debates between our consultant teams and our clinical teams across urgent care and planned care. And indeed, our Deputy Medical Director is a urologist himself and has extensive debates with teams about the consequences. And that is what we've tried to articulate in some of the narrative around why we would want to change this particular service, and particularly noting the benefits to planned care, which we often forget and we think are far less important than those patients who require urgent or emergency care, many of which who have poor outcomes if not dealt with and not operated in an appropriate timescale.
Right. No, thank you very much, Simon, for that. Now, I know we're going to have a problem with meeting all the questions, really. There's a large number of them. So I think actually it may,
Excuse
if
me,
we
Chair,
can't...
I had my
if we
second question
can't,
on the survey.
One?
Chair, I had my second question on the survey.
On the survey?
Yeah, I think
All right, okay, fine. I was going to say
Sandra
that
was going to answer that one.
if we can't complete the questions, we'll have to have written answers. Can you...
Yes, I can. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the feedback too. We do take patient engagement really seriously, and we really do value the patient engagement. And as you say, we are live currently with our patient engagement programme of work at the moment with the Sidings Medical Practice. In fact, tonight we've even got an event that's actually happening at the practice itself. So we do take all different means of patient engagement, whether that would be through questionnaires. We have the market event, as you say, on the Saturday, and we also do other events outside. We are supportive with Health Watch in that, but I would value the feedback that you've given tonight, and we will take that on board in terms of if we've publicised that enough, because the engagement event is actually due to close on Friday. But hearing some of the feedback today, I'll take that back to just to reflect, just to check that we have adequately publicised it in all various different media and social media, and also accommodating that it's slightly different in dealing with this in the middle of the pandemic, where we're doing a bit more through virtual as well as face-to-face. So thank you.
Can I just come back? Yeah. Thank you for that. It's just that a lot of people don't look on Facebook or Twitter and online, so that there is the need to advertise in more, place yourself in somewhere like a supermarket, for example, for where people will actually see and find out about these things. Thank you.
Very important point, about you've got to go where the people are. Councillor Anton Danny, you've got a question for Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just gonna come from the question which was presented by Councillor Jonathan Noble, and this is to Simon. He stated that since 2014 it has been an improvement on certain departments, but if you look at the CQC quality report on the 7th of January 2020, which is just before the pandemic, and I think was done by Professor Edward Baker, he stated that on the day of the report and the examination, they found that people working at the services, they didn't have the right qualifications, they didn't have the skills, they didn't have the training, they didn't have the experience, and goes on and goes on. So I will understand that 2020 we had the pandemic and it will be hard to improve these things. Can you just give us an insight if anything has been improved? And also, can you just tell us clearly what kind of changes are coming towards the Pilgrim in the future? Thank you, Simon.
Simon, are you able to answer those questions?
Yes. In terms of that inspection, obviously, it is still relatively recent, but so over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years, we have, despite COVID, we've made some substantial progress on key elements of that. And in fact, we've had a number of now inspections in a new forum, a new format, sorry, from our inspectors at the CQC on particular services where they had major concerns. Urgent care is one of those areas, and I described that briefly earlier on as one of those where we have made probably one of the greatest levels of improvement. Now that's very difficult to see whilst we're in the middle of a COVID wave 3 pandemic, but over the last year and a half in particular, we've improved the time for patients being treated in the department. We've reduced the number of ambulance delays by 70%. We've improved the response time of patients being triaged. That's the very first contact point in our emergency departments. We've reduced the number of patients who have either had sepsis or have not been screened appropriately for sepsis. We've improved the response times for paediatric patients, for children in ED, being seen by an appropriately qualified children's nurse. And we now have 24/7 a day children's services and paediatric services in ED who are qualified and capable of caring for those patients. That's just an example of one of the main areas that we've been talking about. All of those things are all things that you will be able to experience differently at Boston ED. It has applied to Lincoln as well, but certainly there are the things that we will have seen that have changed and have been very different at the CQC, and we are hoping to be able to announce something relatively soon around the lifting of license restrictions in those particular areas.
Could I just add, please, Chair, that the CQC have continued to inspect hospitals and other services throughout the pandemic. They've clearly had to just adapt the way in which they work. And what I have observed from numerous mini inspections, so to speak, by CQC of ULHT is a consistent, encouraging report back around progress having been made across all of the key areas that they previously identified. So whilst they are yet to come and do a full inspection, certainly they are reporting from the areas that they have looked at much more recently, I think really positive progress in the hospital. Clearly we have to await the full inspection, but I think what Simon said about improvements being made across the Trust and in Pilgrim Hospital, from my perspective, I've observed that from the CQC's feedback of their independent reviews of those services. Thank you.
Does it come into any, does that resolve your? That's fine. Yeah. Thank you, John, and thank you, Simon. Yes, it's fine. Thank you. The only thing we was missing, Simon didn't answer what's the biggest changes coming, because I just want the truth to be told so we can deliver it to our constituents. I think John wants to answer that one.
Thank you. I'll pass to Simon to add any comments he would wish to make, but I wanted to just come back on a matter that Councillor Austin raised as well in relation to stroke. In my opening comments, I said that we were in anticipation that in the coming weeks we would commence a public consultation exercise in relation to a number of key NHS services, and that hasn't started yet, but it will be starting, I anticipate, in the current in the next few weeks or so, and stroke services will be one of those services that we've got proposals on how we would like to take those services forward. We did discuss those proposals and those ideas back in 2019 when we had the Healthy Conversation exercise. And again, there's a very active debate here in Boston in relation to Pilgrim Hospital as a whole and stroke services in particular. So you can anticipate in fairly short order that formal public consultation exercise commencing. And obviously we look forward to having those specific discussions, obviously with people here in Boston, as well as elsewhere in the county in relation to other services as well.
Thank you, John. Councillor Frank Pickett, I think you might have a question, which you may have interest to do with Pilgrim Hospital that you mentioned to me some time ago, and I think it's very pertinent.
Yeah, that's right, Chairman. I'm going to change the mood a bit. Car parks at Pilgrim Hospital. I've been visiting a relative there for about 6 weeks during the summertime, and the potholes that's in that car park at Pilgrim Hospital are ginormously high. I don't know whether you're trying to book up trade for people with broken wrists, ankles, got there as well. But there really are enormous potholes, and I want to know what you're going to do about it, please. Thank you, Jim.
I think Simon will be able to report a lot of action on that front that ULHT are taking forward at the moment. So if I could pass to Simon, please.
Okay, now I've asked this question actually in Health Scrutiny Committee on 2 occasions, 6 months ago and more recently. I think Pilgrim Hospital's car park is probably the most dangerous car park in the country. I don't know whether Pilgrim Hospital are trying to drum up more business from the people who are falling over there, but it's just pretty disgraceful. Simon, do you have an answer for Councillor Frank Pickett, Mayor of Boston?
Yes. So in the last year, we've spent a little over £150,000 in trying to deal with the potholes, whilst we've been undertaking the £40 million infrastructure improvement across all of our hospitals to try and maintain the quality of services and to keep on major infrastructure issues that we've had. ULHT, you will no doubt be aware of, hasn't had a substantial capital infrastructure for a number of years prior to the last 18 months, 2 years. And indeed, the states of our hospitals have deteriorated significantly. However, during COVID, as I said, we've had the largest capital investment that we've had, as far as I can see, going back in the history of ULHT in improving our sites. And whilst we've only spent a relatively small amount of that in terms of our car parking, we do have plans to substantially improve and create new decking car parks in order to reduce the need for the flat surface car parks that we've got now, and so that we can then close those down and do the major works that are required in order to fully renovate them. In addition to that, we have lighting and security systems that are going to be going in this year as well, because we also know that lighting and also security cameras have been raised as concerns, not just by patients, but also our own staff, and we'll be investing in that as well. So over the course of this year, we should start to see the beginnings of substantial improvements, and hopefully the development of a decking system, a new car park that's fit for purpose and in 21st century style car park, as opposed to the flat surfaces that we've had up until now.
Well, Simon, I'd like to come back and point out that patients pay to use that car park. It's not free, so I want to understand that you may be short of cash, but the fact is that people pay to use the car parks. And if money's being paid out to use the car park, that's where the money should go for the maintenance of the car park. I realise you've got other expenses, but it's a key area. And it's dangerous, actually, because my wife had to have a emergency hip operation 6 months ago, and I had to wheel her out to the hospital, and I thought actually there's a very good chance I'd have to wheel her back in again, because if I went into one of those holes. So it's a serious matter, but patients and visitors pay, as do staff, and it's quite an issue amongst staff, I know that. So parking is something we need to sort out. The holes, I'm sure, can be sorted out for a relatively small fee. I'm sure that's so, but there are other issues associated with it, and the computer system, I suppose, which involves the charging of it particularly regards to staff. So it's a sore subject around here. Do any of our colleagues over there, John Turner and Andrew, had you any comments? Have you ever visited the car park there and got away alive?
I have visited the car park on many occasions, and I completely get what you're talking about. I wouldn't say anything more than that. I've been down a number of potholes in my time.
Maybe the Wombles could clean them up, then I'll fill them in.
There's a possibility you could go down one of those potholes and never come back up again. But anyway, I've got Judy Wellborn want to come back again. She's asking to speak, to give us 2 questions. I'm really conscious of the time, so we'll have to move on as quick as we can. Judy, are you there?
Yeah, I'll be very
You've got 2
quick.
questions.
Yeah, very quick.
That's fine. Yeah.
My first question basically is, with all the services going to sort of private hospitals and, as we were told, probably Peterborough and even as far as Gaul, what happens to people who don't have any transport, their families or anything else? How do they get people there? I know several people who have struggled and had to cancel appointments because they cannot get to any of these hospitals. And my second one is it acceptable for a lady of 63 years of age to wait 12 hours for an ambulance with a broken pelvis? Thank you.
Who wants to answer that, particularly with the 12-hour wait?
No, it's not acceptable at all, is it?
No.
We are seeing in the county and indeed across the country some very, very worrying stories in the media in relation to patients who aren't being attended to by ambulance services, or indeed being attended to in another way, because quite frankly of the sheer demand that there is on the NHS at the moment. So it's clearly completely unacceptable. I know, because I speak with my senior colleagues in the East Midlands Ambulance Service on a regular basis, just how hard the ambulance teams are working to get to people, the extra hours that they're putting in and the demands that is putting upon them. So it is not acceptable, but it is just where we are on certain days at certain times in relation to the overwhelming demands that the NHS is under at the moment, which I obviously alluded to in my opening comments. So I'm exceptionally sorry to hear of that story. I wouldn't want to happen to anyone. None of us would. And if there are any details that you'd wish to share that we can then look into in terms of that particular case, then we'll be happy to. But clearly a 12-hour wait for a lady in that condition is absolutely unacceptable. And I wonder if I could pass to Simon for the first issue that was raised, please.
I did wonder actually whether, Andrew, you're looking at, do you have a comment you wish to make, or do you wish to remain silent, as they say?
I'm quite happy being silent. I would echo what John has said, right? Okay, sorry. I would echo what John has said. I find it unacceptable. And I'm sat at the sharp end in general practice because we actually then get the phone call saying, why hasn't the ambulance turned up? That causes distress to my staff. It causes distress to us. But I can't justify it. I think it reflects the challenges that EMAS has with the number of ambulances, the staff that it has, the dispersed population that we have in Lincolnshire. It's unacceptable.
If you watch the TV programs on this with the ambulance service, you get a pretty good idea about what's going on nationally. And when I heard, I think, one particular program where people are being shipped out of Scotland to go to the north of England, you get a feeling that some things aren't quite right, as they are not. Judy, have your questions been answered to your satisfaction?
I think I'm just waiting for the second one to be answered, but
right.
If anybody could give me any details so I can put through a complaint on behalf of this lady, then I'll be quite happy to, as her ward councillor. Thank you.
Right, okay. Simon, you're now online, if that's possible. Simon?
Okay, so I think your question was around the a number of locations across Lincolnshire, and that sort of accessibility for patients to be able to get to them. And I think one of the things that we have been very careful about in terms of being able to provide, particularly for planned care and the recovery of that backlog of patients that need operations, is making sure that we maintain access for patients. And we've done and continue to do. In fact, Sandra works very closely with a team that I run, looking at access to services, making sure that patients are able to get to the relevant places. And whilst we try to create places like Grantham where we have high volumes, we still recognise that we have to have other services that are closer to people's homes so that they can get regular access, and where they need an operation, it needs to be one that they can get to either via support with transport, or it's somewhere within their local area. The use of independent sector is actually helping us with that, because they're increasing the number of places that we can do operations, and actually Boston has its own private hospital where a lot of activity has been taking place, but also just up the road we have additional independent sector as well, which is on the East Coast as opposed to having to travel further inland. So the moment that's helping us, and we're able to offer a greater level of accessibility for people. And then just in terms of previously, I think in terms of the car parking, I think you misunderstood me in terms of what I was describing that in your comment around not taking it seriously. We are taking it very seriously, and that's why we've spent the money that we have over the course of this year. In fact, we made it free to our staff, and it remains free in terms of car parking, which has cost us £250,000 in the trust. And as I said, we're looking to invest millions of pounds then in terms of that improvement. So we are very much taking it seriously in the context of an international pandemic.
Well, thank you, Simon. Yes.
Can I ask Simon how much he collects in annually from the car parking charges?
Very good question. Simon, can you answer that question from Councillor David Brown?
I can't answer that, but I can.
Do you say it again?
I can't.
David,
he wants to hear the question again. Simon is talking about expenditure to the National Health Service for the cost of the car parks, etc. I would have thought the parking charge would have been ring-fenced to make for provision of maintenance of the car park. And I'm just wondering, he's mentioned about spending £125,000, which is not a lot. You don't get a lot of civil engineering for £125,000. But I just wanted to know how much annually the car park receives from the paying public.
I can't give you that figure off the top of my head, but what we're in. Okay, let's just stop it there then, shall we?
Perhaps it's 5 million.
Laugh at my answers. No, it's not.
I think actually I'm going to ask Katie Chalmers if she can. She wants to make, and then I'll let Jonathan have another go once. I've got one question at the end to ask.
Right, given all of that, I've written quite a few notes, but I'll fly through them. So I've gone back to the person that was talking to me about testing, and as of today, they spoke to the sidings, and they're not testing for fungal infections, and they're not testing for prostate cancer because of the bottle shortage, which reminded me that you said about, or it was said about oncology going to Grantham to clear the cancer patients, but actually, should we not be looking for new suppliers of bottles in the UK so somebody that potentially has prostate cancer can get fixed immediately rather than waiting 6 months down the line? Also, the sidings was mentioned. I do social media. I'm a sidings patient, and I didn't see anything about what they were up to. But they do send text messages out, so why didn't they? And which reminded me, Lickapon Street, I rang on behalf of a patient and spent an hour on the phone before getting kicked off their system without anyone answering. So these are all low-level, unskilled people that are missing in the service that would actually make poorly people's lives better. The patient I was calling on behalf of on Lincolnshire Street was too poorly to pick up the phone themselves. So that they were lucky they had me, but other patients wouldn't have done. And that really is basic. It's like the car park.
Chair, I can concur with Lincolnshire Street Surgery, which is what I'm a member of. That they changed their telephone service, and they do just cut you off, which is diabolical.
Fine,
I
that's
totally
confirmation.
agree with you because my wife has been calling them and has been cut off many times.
So we have 3 people supporting that. John, I think it's probably for you to field that, isn't it? Or
Yeah,
no?
I can only say we shall take that away and we will pick that up with the surgery at Licker Ponds tomorrow, won't we, Sandra? So thank you for that feedback. This is really important, actually, because without you, and obviously you represent the public here, being able to feedback what they're telling you about their experience, we can't then challenge whether it's the hospital, the GP surgeries, or whoever in terms of what's going on. So we will absolutely commit to taking that back.
Chair, can I just say that Lincolnshire Street Surgery changed their phone number and they didn't advise me, so they won't have advised anyone, and that was absolute diabolical.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. I mean, it's a key factor, isn't it? If you don't know the phone number, you can't ring the doctor.
Key way of we're not getting any calls. Wonder why.
If I may, please, Chairman. Judith, did they put a tape on when you phoned the wrong number? Did it say the number has now been changed?
No, Councillor Brown, it just went dead.
Oh.
And the way I found out they changed the phone number was from the pharmacy next door.
John, do you want to come back and field that?
Only to reiterate, we shall pick that up with the practice in the morning.
Yes.
Thank you.
We have, there's obviously a lot of questions. I've asked a lot of questions. It's not possible to get through those tonight. We will finish at 9. So if we haven't been able to ask the questions, I think we ought to have written answers if it's possible. All the questions have been asked. So then members can then see at least there's an answer to the questions that have been provided. Because some have been provided by myself and other members, and some from members of the public. So it's important that there's an answer. If that's fine with you, is it?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I just wonder if, by follow-up, if Andy could just confirm which of the questions that we haven't answered, or there's any follow-up on. We're very happy to do that. Thank you.
I couldn't work without Andy, and it tells me what to do with them. Guides me all the time. That's right, isn't it? You try and support me. Definitely. Well, it's brilliant. And yes, Jonathan, I think you have a question you want to go for, don't you?
Thanks, Chair. I will be quick. And I did, to help the committee, I did submit my questions several weeks ago, actually. So I'll just 2. I'm going to put 2 together, one of them, this was 21. Why did so many inpatients contract and die of COVID-19 whilst in NHS hospitals? Reckoned to be at least 10%. But I did some research this afternoon. This is a Guardian article on the 26th of March. 21. Research by Public Health England found that 15.5% of all cases of COVID among hospitalised patients had either probably or definitely occurred while they were in hospital. And that's followed up by an article in the Guardian on the 17th of May, which then said up to 20% of hospital patients probably contracted the virus in hospital. So my question is, why are so many people contracting in NHS hospitals? Is there a problem with basic sanitation? Do they not open the windows enough to allow fresh air to escape? We know which is of fundamental importance. Thank you.
Well, who wants to answer? Do you think Simon or yourself, John?
Well, could I start and then pass to Simon,
yes,
please? So I'm not familiar with the article. Clearly, if it was reflecting practice last year when the pandemic broke out.
21. These leaders come from 21. Sorry, it was March 21 and May 21. That was this year. That was the articles that came out on those months and that year.
But just to clarify, what time period were they referring to?
I haven't written that down.
Okay. The reason for that is because I think you'll be familiar that during the course of 2020, when the pandemic broke out, clearly this was an illness that we weren't familiar with. You'll be aware of how quickly we had to mobilise things like our staff, the protective equipment. You remember the challenges around all of that. We were learning a lot in the early stages of the pandemic about how best to deal with it and to manage it in our communities and in our hospitals as well. What I certainly have observed, and I'll pass to Simon in a moment, is that the practice of infection prevention and control, which clearly came in as part of the response, has been very effective more recently. So certainly during the course of 21, the government, NHS England, have been very, very clear about having the right controls in place in the hospitals, distance between beds, staff wearing face masks, all of those proper use of PPE. So all of those issues, which I think it's fair, were a struggle for us during the first phase of the pandemic. I think there is pretty strong practice in place now, certainly in the hospitals in Lincolnshire that I observe. So I'll pause my comments there, and I'll ask Simon to come in with any more specific comments, please.
All right, Simon, do you want to continue on the pass? Follow on from John.
Yep, thank you. Okay. Certainly our response to it has radically changed since wave one at the beginning of the pandemic through to current practice. And that also includes how we designate people as probable or likely. In wave one, there wasn't a system in order to identify probable or likely nosocomial transmission that's acquired in hospital, essentially. And in fact, right at the beginning of wave one, across the length and breadth of the nation, in terms of the medical examiners and the way that we were capturing the deaths and associated to COVID-19, that just didn't record enough detail for us to be able to accurately identify that nationally. That improved during wave two, and we got a much better understanding, and we did change a number of things. Although you describe it in terms of sanitation, ventilation was a significant learning point nationally in terms of how we were managing air systems and proximity of patients to open windows and various other elements that we put in place during wave two, and that did have a positive effect. However, the other substantial change that we've seen is the Delta variant, the variant that is claimed to have started over in India, had a substantially different behaviour, and that's why wave two in particular, coming out of wave two, was so substantially high impact on hospitals. In fact, we had more than a quarter of every bed in United Lincolnshire hospitals had COVID positive patients in, and then more than that again had contact with patients who had been COVID positive. So 50% of every patient in our hospitals had either COVID or had come into contact with someone who had COVID. And when you face that particular situation, even the very newest and best hospitals in terms of ventilation systems and infection prevention control systems aren't able to contain it. As I say, wave three has made a substantially better impact, and vaccination has clearly had a huge impact for us as well. And that's why certainly the rates in wave three are significantly lower than wave two.
Thank you. And with your indulgence, Chair, and the committee's last question. Given that there have been several epidemics of the last 30 years, SARS, avian flu, etc., why was it not deemed expedient to increase the number of beds at Pilgrim and other ULHT hospitals in the not unreasonable expectation that a pandemic such as COVID-19 would at some stage break out?
I could make some opening comments in relation to that, and Simon may wish to make some specific in relation to ULHT. You may or may not be aware that the outbreak of a pandemic has for many years been the number one risk on the country's risk register. That has been widely reported in the media. Interestingly, above terrorist attacks as well. I think it has been also widely reported that we as a country were not as prepared as we, on reflection, should have been for the pandemic. That is something that is an issue for the country as a whole, and I'm sure will come out when there is a full public inquiry that looks at all of the issues. You may also be aware, in relation to the number of beds in the country, that for a long number of years until recently, there has been a reduction in hospital beds in England as a whole, and that has been a direct consequence of government policy over a long period of time. A couple of years ago, actually, that changed, and there was an expectation that going forward there would be no further reduction in beds across the country, and in fact there would be a likely increase in hospital beds. So that's just a bit of context, and I'll pass to Simon to make any more specific comments in relation to ULHT, please. Simon.
Thank you. We did sizably increase the number of beds in our hospitals, particularly during wave 2. At our peak, we had increased our bed stock by more than 200 beds. We have 900 and circa 900 normally in terms of our capacity, and we went up to nearly 1100. Within that, we also increased our critical care. That's the area that looks after the sickest patients, very, very intensive, has often 1-to-1, if not 2-to-1 care from nurses and from doctors, and we increased that by 180% during wave 2. So we were able to carry out our surge plan, and we were able to respond not only to Lincolnshire patients, and I'm pleased to say every Lincolnshire patient that needed critical care got a critical care bed and got it in Lincolnshire, but we also supported our neighbouring systems who were very much overwhelmed, and were able to support Nottinghamshire with some of their critical care demand as well, in order to keep their services safe and to help us with services like major trauma during that period.
Thank you, Chair, for the indulgence. Thank you, gentlemen, for answering my questions. Thank you.
I have a question from Katie Chalmers. Councillor Katie, that's right. Not come up. You want to ask a question? I have one more. I'm sure there are others. Do you want to ask a question? Do you have a question? No?
Thank you.
No?
We've touched quite heavily on the percentage, patients being sent to private hospitals to clear the backlog. What percentage of patients overall are we going to shift to private to clear them? Because no number could just mean that you've sent 3.
If I could just start in responding to that, what we will do over the coming months, and I suspect years, is do everything that we possibly can do to get people in Lincolnshire, remember more than 1 in 10 waiting for an operation at the moment, to have their operation. We will be as innovative as we can be in the way in which we use the NHS estate, the NHS staff, the private sector estate, and anything else that we can draw on to ensure we work our way through this backlog as quickly as we can. In terms of, I know you've asked several times about specifics. If you just think about it, in normal times, we were working at pretty much maximum capacity in terms of operations. We're now on top of normal times. We've got the backlog that we know about, but also we have the backlog that is yet to materialize because people have yet to present to their GP, and their GP then to refer them in to the hospital services. So there isn't a specific number that we know we're going to have to get through in the next year, the next 2 years. So it is a bit ambiguous, that. Our task, and very clearly on the back of the health and social care levy change last year as well, and the expectations about recovery in the NHS, is to do all that we possibly can to get the waiting list down and caught up on people's operations as quickly as we possibly can. So that's the approach that we're taking. We're going to throw the kitchen sink and everything else that we possibly can to that, bearing in mind at the same time, we still have a considerable number of COVID patients in hospital, and people seeking urgent care rather than just getting their operation are at the highest levels we've pretty much ever seen at the moment. So I'll pause there. Simon, is there anything else you'd like to add, please?
Simon, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, John's covered everything. I mean, I think your answer was around numbers, and we'll be able to give you more numbers offline. We're talking thousands of patients here. We're not talking 2 or 3.
I have one question actually, but wasn't on my list, but it was discussed at Health Scrutiny the other day, and it concerns nuclear medicine. Nuclear medicine is a very important part of the offering from the hospitals. And I noticed that Lincoln itself has less than half of the patients for this, but it has almost all the staff. You know, it's 15 members of staff, I think it is, 47% of the patients. The Pilgrim has 28% of the patients and 4 people, I think it is. There's a considerable imbalance, isn't there, between the 2 hospitals. And I have that feeling that yet again, we have this business about you've got to go to Lincoln for this particular form of treatment, should we say. Now, I know somebody, as a counsellor actually, county counsellor, whose life was saved through this. Very, very important. So what can the ULHT do to improve the facilities at Boston Pilgrim to give it the same status, if you like, as Lincoln County? Because it's not just urology, it's not just pediatrics. There are these other services that perhaps people don't know about, which are not being given the same importance in Boston as they are in Lincoln. And you know, traveling to Lincoln is difficult. There's no direct train service. If you haven't got a car, well, walking's a long way, isn't it? So Simon, what about nuclear medicine?
I think it'd be inappropriate for me to answer that question, given that we're now starting the process of formulating options. That process, as you will have heard from Health Overview Scrutiny Committee, starts this week. We'll be asking questions of multiple stakeholders of their perspective and their take on the various different elements of the service, of which your comments tonight I will absolutely take away and feed into that engagement exercise. And then we will publish a series of options which will describe how we envisage we could address some of the challenges that we described in the paper at Health Overview Scrutiny Committee, is that a service that we can't carry on with the current configuration for a number of reasons, as was stipulated, but we do need to work up those options.
I may just come back on one point of this. I did investigate the salaries associated with this particular service, and they're not that brilliant. You need a physics degree to be able to do the nuclear medicine side of things as a physician. It's a key area. I suggest that the health service looks at the salaries it pays in these areas, because it's a key facility, key area. And I know that Health Scrutiny will be coming back to this. I want a full report on this key area. Do you want to come back on that, or shall I? No, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to ask Councillor Alison Austin to make a comment. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask Councillor Alison Austin, because we're getting very short of time here.
Thank you, Chairman. My question actually is going back to COVID again. Is that okay? I can't remember whether it was something said to me, something I heard or read, but that the uptake, of people just turning up for walk-in vaccinations in Boston is lower than elsewhere. And of course, and they're even talking now about running complementary buses, I think, to the PRSA, which is where the walk-in centre is. But would it be more sensible to find a centre that is in the walk-in centre, which is actually in the centre of Boston, because it's a long way out to the PRSA, and a lot of people don't have the wherewithal to get it. And to find a complimentary bus, well, no, that's not what we want. We want to be able to go somewhere immediately. Thank you.
John, were you able to answer that one? Who wants? That's all right.
They're already doing the complimentary bus. That was Dickinson's that were
Lincoln,
doing
isn't
it. It's been advertised. I think it was part of. It was on Boston Council's.
Free from Boots. It's in the town centre from Boots for free.
The thing is that I think the point to be made is that would it better to have centre directly in the centre of town for to do this?
You want me to start asking?
Go on.
Yeah, so I think it's a really, really valid point, and thank you for raising it. We did put a complimentary bus service onto the PRSA site, as you say, but we are now looking, as part of the phase 3 plans, we'll be looking to bring it back into Boston as well, which is the booster plans, sorry. So part of that booster plans we'll be looking at, that will be in the centre of Boston, and I'm sure Andrew will add to it, because it's all of our practices are engaging in that booster programme. So that means we'll be able to provide to all of our locations within the Boston and the surrounding area. Would you like to add anything, Andrew?
All I would add is that 3 of the practices are very experienced in doing this and will support the other 3 practices who weren't involved in the vaccination programme the first time based at the sidings. The Boston PCN has worked together and with negotiation and support from the CCG should be able to be delivering the booster vaccines within your own surgeries.
May I come back, Chairman? But it may not be a case of a booster injection. It's people suddenly realizing, oh, I've not had one, and not everyone is registered. We know this. Not everyone is registered with a GP in this town, unfortunately, and therefore, you know, they're not necessarily aware of, you know, the sidings, or, well, it's got to be something that's pretty obvious, hasn't it? You know, saying, walk in for your vaccination here.
If I may come back, because just I'm going to answer in your place, because I have a coffee shop in the town center. I took a leaflet from some of our workers, which is translated to Russian, Bulgarian, Romanian, and I give it to them on the tables, and they say no, they don't want the vaccine. You can, for me, I get bemused when you give them on the table, this is for the vaccine, I don't want it. So I think it's a hard job for you, and it's a hard job to deal with the people if they're not registered and they don't want the vaccine. It's, I don't know. I think it's a matter of the government to do something about it, or put a legislation to correct this kind of behaviors. People come into the country to work here, they're more than welcomed, and you give them a leaflet and they say, no, I don't want it.
We have experienced a lot of vaccine hesitancy in that group. I would agree with that. We do actually also have a COVID vaccine facility in the Parkside Pharmacy that has been running for a while in the centre of town, and they have done walk-in sessions as well. So, and that came into being when the main GP-led one reached the down to 50 and had completed that part of the exercise. That was then a development to support that within the town itself. So there is that facility there, and it's been running for some time. And how much is used does seem to vary, and you can all gauge that by the number of people queuing outside the pharmacy.
I'm now going to call a halt. I think it's 9 o'clock, isn't it? And I think our guests have worked hard enough for us tonight. And we're not going to be here till 2 o'clock in the morning. Yes, Judith, what have I done wrong now?
Just as we're winding up, can I say, and I'm sure on behalf of all the other committee members, thank you to our guests for coming here and answering all our questions. I think you've been very well scrutinised. And if some of the questions that you're taking away regarding Lincoln surgery, if they could feed them back in through our officer, because it would be very nice to see what the answers are to some of those things. And if you could pass on to all the staff that work in the NHS in the Boston surrounding areas our heartfelt thanks for all that they've done over this period of the pandemic.
Yes,
We really appreciate them. The ones that are on the cold face and the ones that are in your positions as well.
This is well supported by everybody in the room. We're very grateful for you coming tonight. I half expected you to be on the screen, which is never good enough, but you've come to see us, which is wonderful, I think. And we fully appreciate everything you've done and are doing on our behalf, serving the community. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming. We have one more item for ourselves, I'm afraid, so we can't leave. Although I understand that can we have 1 minute? And it is 1 minute. It's to do with the work programme, and Andy wants to make one statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman. If I can be very quick to help you end your meeting speedily. The committee's next meeting, 4th of November, has 2 items on it. Review of the terms of reference, which we're going to work through collectively. And then there was the upgrading of a case management system. My colleague has said to me that that's not going to be ready for the next committee, but I've had a request from our senior leadership team that James and I bring to you as the most relevant scrutiny committee, a paper in relation to the council's actions from its 2019 peer review. As we move towards a 3-way partnership with South Holland, building on our alliance with East Lindsey, it would be really valuable for the committee to scrutinise the 2019 action plan so that we can account for exactly where we've brought ourselves to based on all the recommendations of our peers. That's the request that's come from senior leadership team. Clearly, Mr. Chairman, it's for the committee to consider if it will accept that, but senior leadership would be incredibly grateful if you did and gave us feedback on the performance that we've collectively achieved over that time.
So what can we say? Well, is it? Oh, it's yes, right, okay. There you have it. It's yes. Right. Is that all right, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen? Yes? Good.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for everybody who came tonight. Thank you very much, in particular, for our guests. And the meeting's closed, and we can go home now.